I lived in a haunted house for over 2 decades, so there are several examples of things that happened over the years. The house was built in the early 1700s. It was a beautiful, rambling old house with a big garden, outbuildings, 5 bedrooms, and working fireplaces. My parents, my 3 siblings, and I were overjoyed to be moving into this spacious house after living in a cramped 2.5 bedroom terrace with no garden. My parents had bought the house for an incredibly low price. Even for the 90s, it was cheap. I do wonder now if it was something to do with the hauntings. Anyway, it wasn't long before we realized we weren't the only residents. A few days after we moved in, my mom was downstairs in the long hallway, which ran the length of the house from the floor door to the kitchen past the wide old staircase. As she watched, she saw the shadow of a man who seemed to be dressed in Jacobean clothing based on the silhouette walk along the wall and then disappear into the wall by the stairs as if it had walked through a door that wasn't there. But that was only the start. We quickly got used to seeing and hearing things that weren't there. We'd constantly see black shapes swiftly moving out of the corner of our eyes. When we'd turn to look, there'd be no one there. Late at night, after everyone had gone to bed, we would often hear voices talk softly at the base of the stairs. It sounded like 3 or 4 men murmuring to each other, like a group of people planning something. But if we went up to the stairs to listen, the voices abruptly stopped. Now bear in mind, this was a detached house with thick, solid walls and only a quiet old couple for neighbors. We called the voices the murmuring men and grew quite fond of them. My brother liked to stay up late and play video games in his room. Between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., he would often see a woman standing in his bedroom. She was wearing an apron over a Victorian dress. He told us about it, and we all agreed that it was weird. Later, when we were having the house renovated, we discovered old servants' bells in the room, so perhaps she'd been a servant and was checking if the young master wanted anything. As well as seeing and hearing things, there were other indications that we weren't alone. Things would go missing. Little objects you'd swear you'd left on the side. We'd all look high and low with no sign of whatever it was. Then later, that same object would turn up in an incredibly unlikely place, like on top of a wardrobe or somewhere that had already been searched. We'd even joke that the house had taken it, and sometimes, exasperated, my mom would yell, "Come on, house, this isn't funny, give it back," which usually resulted in it turning up a day or so later. But despite these ghostly encounters, it was a very cozy home. Everyone who visited noted how welcoming and open the house felt. After my parents divorced, that changed. My mother continued to live in the house with us kids and made some adjustments to it so she could put it on the market. I don't know if that alone shook the spirits up or whether it was because we were all sad and depressed following the divorce and those emotions were feeding things, but the atmosphere in the house changed completely. It grew heavy, oppressive. You would feel like someone was watching you in the hallway. None of us kids would go upstairs at night by ourselves. We'd wait and go together. You just did not want to be alone in the hallway or on the stairs. That feeling that something was right behind you was intense. My sister had to go downstairs alone at one point, and as she was walking back to the stairs, she heard booted footsteps walking behind her. She closed her eyes and ran back upstairs as fast as she could. One afternoon, I was in my room reading. I suddenly heard a woman sobbing loudly. She sounded like her heart was broken. I thought it must be my mom or maybe my sister. I ran out onto the landing and called, "Mom? Sis? What is it?" There was no one there. The noise stopped. I ran downstairs and my mom and sister were sitting, chatting happily in the kitchen. They were fine. They hadn't heard a thing. 6 months later, my brother and sister heard the same woman crying, and my brother thought he'd seen what looked like a swish of a dark blue skirt on the landing, but he couldn't be sure. My mom came upstairs one night to her bedroom and found every item on her dressing table had been pushed to the floor as if someone had swept it off. We'd all been downstairs and her window was closed. Late one evening, my sister was doing the washing up in the kitchen. The sink was in front of a large sash window. The glass in the windows is old. I don't know if it's as old as the house, but it's thick and very wavy and distorts the reflections in them. As she was washing up, she felt the presence of someone in the room with her, someone taller than her, standing behind her. She thought it must be one of our brothers and looked up to see a tall reflection in the window. She turned around to speak to them, and no one was there. My mom called the local vicar. and he came around with a specialist colleague and blessed the house. They sprinkled holy water and said prayers, and it definitely seemed to help. They sprinkled holy water and said prayers, and it definitely seemed to help. The house felt lighter, and we didn't see or hear anything else. My mom sold the house, and at the same time, I left home and moved into my own home. Someone else lives there now, and I often wonder if the spirits have come out again to see the new owners. I've always known that unexplained entities exist in this world. I've never had a significant experience, such as an apparition, and I'm thankful because I'd rather not, to be honest, but I've experienced minor things here and there. 2 experiences I can recount occurred at my Oma, which is the German word for grandma, and Opa's house here in Hawaii. I've also had quite a few family members share their more terrifying experiences with me over the years, which also happened in said house. But let's start with my own from my most recent experience. I am currently a 27-year-old female, ancient, I know, and would often sleep over at Oma's house from 5 to 15 years old, mostly on weekends. I enjoyed being there as she and I were really close. She spoiled me from when I could first talk, up until when she lost her memory to dementia. Yeah, that's depressing. It's an evil disease that causes everyone you love some major suffering as they slowly forget who you and your family members are. Anyway, she was a huge jokester, always laughing, farting, tickling, making sarcastic remarks, and jumping out to scare any and all of her family members. It was a Friday night, and I was 14 years old. I was on the PC they had in their designated computer room because I couldn't sleep. The room is about the size of a bigger closet, just big enough to comfortably fit a desk, PC, and 2 chairs in it. If you're sitting on the chair facing the PC, the door is behind and to the left of you, so you can't see if someone comes in unless you turn to the left. Directly across the hallway is the room I would sleep in, and if you were to take a right outside of the computer room, you could see my grandparents' room at the other end of the hallway. Now, I've always had an ominous feeling being in that house when night would fall, especially after my grandparents went to bed and I was the only one awake. So there I was, on MSN Messenger talking with one of my friends. The clock showed something between 1 and 2 a.m. I was starting to get sleepy, but being a teenager, it'd be way too uncool to sleep early on a Friday night. Because I was distracted, I felt completely at ease. No spooky feelings or chill in the air, nor was I the slightest bit paranoid. That is until I feel someone blow lightly in my left ear, 2 times, back to back. Oh my, I explained, starting to laugh and turning to face her, except she wasn't there. It was no one. Oh my, I called while standing up out of my chair, fully expecting her to be hiding in my temporary room as I peeked in, ready to surprise her. It was empty. I then started to look down the hallway, knowing her room door would be open, which would prove she had snuck out to scare me. It was closed. She always slept with it closed. She hadn't been the one to blow in my ear. My grandpa certainly isn't the type to pull pranks on me. He is a hard-butt, old-school guy from the Philippines. This is the last thing he would do. Nor is he fast enough to pull this sort of thing. I was the only other person in this house aside from them. If it wasn't either of them, who was it? My second encounter happened several years before this one. It was a holiday evening sometime back in the mid-2000s, and all of my Oma's children, 1 out of 4 being my mom, their spouses, and their children were over. I was around 9 years old and was filled with energy. My cousin Derek was around 7 years old. He and I were tossing a tennis ball back and forth in the house on the first floor. Everyone was either in the living room, kitchen, or in the front yard. There was a carpeted staircase that ran perpendicular from the living room straight up to the second floor. From the bottom of the staircase, you could see most of the living room and obviously up the stairs. From the top of the staircase, you could see the stairwell down to the bottom and a small fraction of the living room. It consisted of about 15 stairs and had its own light bulb, so no one would have to blindly walk the stairs at night. We decided to move the ball tossing to the stairs because why not? I was on the very top and Derek was at the bottom. We were bouncing the ball lightly up and down the stairs for about 15 minutes until our parents told us to go eat dinner. I caught the ball and flicked the light switch for the stairwell to the down position to turn the light off and then ran down the stairs to get food. After making our plates, we sat in the living room. "Can you turn the light off?" my auntie asked me, being the last one to use the light in the stairwell. Puzzled, I looked up at the now illuminated bulb. I set my plate on the table, charged up the stairs, flicked the switch down again, and ran back down the stairs. A few minutes go by and we're shoveling our faces with delicious food. "I thought Auntie Tammy asked you to turn the light off," my mom questions me. My heart sank as I looked up at the stair light on once again. "I did turn it off," I said confidently. "The switch was up, so I made sure I turned it down and saw the light shut off while I was up there." My mom looked at me unconvinced. "I don't think so," she says. "No, I saw her turn it off," my auntie explains. "I saw it turn back on when she came downstairs after a few seconds, but I didn't want to say anything. My grandparents have now been passed away for some years now, and the house has been sold, a decision that was agreed upon by their children. I have had many dreams of being in that house over the years, and honest to God, they've never been good. Not a single good dream. They always involved an evil entity residing there. My family knows the new owners of the house and is contacted every so often. Apparently, they've had quite a few unexplainable occurrences of their own since moving in." Okay, so my parents' old house was haunted. The first night I ever remember sleeping there, I slept on a pull-out bed in their living room. I remember hearing footsteps circling me for what seemed like hours while I was laying in bed in the dark. The weirder thing was that the entire living room was carpeted, but the footsteps sounded like men's dress shoes on a hardwood floor. After that, my sister and I would constantly notice the lights or the radio going on and off by themselves. My sister and some of her little friends went through a witchy phase and ended up having a seance in her room and took photos when they did it. That was back before digital photos were a thing, and when she got the photos developed, all the light from the candles looked like it was just smeared across all the photos in a dark room. So much so, in fact, that that's all you could even see in the photos at all. Smeared light in an otherwise dark room. And the weirder part was that she told me the lights were on in the room the whole time. I think after she did that, she may have invited something less friendly there, because I remember sometimes getting so creeped out in the living room at night that I would literally run through the room to get out of it as quickly as possible. I've lived in a few haunted houses, the second of which was mine and my husband's when I was barely 18. It was a trailer in a really nice trailer park. Anyway, when my friend and I were in my bedroom waiting for our guys to get back from somewhere one night, we suddenly heard them walk in the front door, so we both got up to go see what took them so long. And when we got to the front door, no one was there. We were both baffled and freaked out. Another time, I had woken up before anyone else in the house, and I heard my stepson get up and turn the TV on in the living room. So I went to greet him since our rooms were on opposite ends of the living room. When I got there though, no one was up and the TV was off still. About 10 seconds later, I saw him come off sleepy-eyed from his room, having just that second woken up. Other times, and quite often especially when I was alone, I'd hear knocking all over the living room walls, like someone was knocking from inside the walls or something. It was really creepy, but not nearly as creepy as whatever was in my parents' house. Whatever that was, terrified me. I had a childhood best friend named Daniel. He lived in the building next to mine in 1993, if I remember correctly, but we called him Dan for short. This is his story, and he swears it's totally true. Since Dan was 8 or 9 years old, his mother, stepfather, and he moved to a small neighborhood in a city in South America, which is located in a valley and is surrounded by a big mountain on all sides. The neighborhood was on the east side of the city, on a dead-end street of a closed neighborhood, but there were a lot of green areas around it, such as small hills with big and small trees, plants, flowers, grass, 2 parks, and a sports court. When Dan and his family moved to the neighborhood, he was very happy because when they were getting there in his mom's car, he could see a lot of places where he could play in. So as a kid, that was very exciting for him. Even though the hills, woods, and plants that surrounded Dan's new neighborhood looked really nice during the day, they looked very dark and creepy at night, and he thought they were really scary. He felt an ominous presence from the woods at night. At that age, Dan was afraid of many things: the dark, the woods, wolves, black dogs and cats, spiders, sharks, you name it. Just like me, and this was because he was a total mama's boy at 5 years old and for most of his life. When Dan and I met for the first time, we were both playing in the park while our babysitters were watching us. We immediately bonded and became friends because we had a lot of things in common. We started talking about our favorite TV shows and movies such as Star Wars, Dragon Ball Z, the X-Men cartoons, and Ninja Turtles, among many others. So we used to play by pretending we were superheroes or some other cartoon characters while running around using the merry-go-round, the slides, or the swings. Funny enough, we both had plastic lightsabers, so we fought as if we were Jedis or Ninja Turtles, but we never stayed in the park once the sun went down because our sitters did not let us, and we were scared of the woods around it. However, Dan was not my only friend in the neighborhood. I introduced him to my other friends who lived in my building and other buildings and houses. Their names were Eliza, Diego, JP, Mike, Laura, and Jared. All of us were around the same age, and we all became great friends as the months went by because almost every afternoon we played sports, played in the park, trick-or-treated, had water balloon fights, played Nintendo together, climbed the hills and woods behind our buildings during the day, and did just about everything else together. The neighborhood kids liked to joke around by saying that the woods behind the buildings were haunted. At that time, we played hide and seek or cops and robbers, so we ran around the street until 7 p.m. because that was our curfew and we had to do our boring homework. But Dan and I went to bed late at night in secret while we talked quietly on the phone. That night, it was like 9 or 10 p.m. I think, and Dan asked me the following. "Did you watch X-Men today?" "Yeah, dude, of course. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Did you see the fight against Apocalypse and the 4 Horsemen?" I replied. He said, "Yeah, dude, the fight was awesome. I loved it. But talking about something else, have you heard some creepy noises behind your building at night?" I replied, "No, bro, I'm a deep sleeper, so I usually black out everything around me." Dan seemed like he was jealous. He said, "Wow, I wish I were that lucky. I usually can hear footsteps in those woods at night, and I also sleepwalk sometimes." "Well, I think it's time for me to go to sleep. See you tomorrow and take care, bro." I replied, "Sure thing, man. Talk tomorrow, and you take care too." Dan hung up his favorite hamburger-shaped phone, sat down in bed, grabbed an old fantasy book about dragons that was on his nightstand, and started reading until he began to close his eyes and doze off. He fell into a deep slumber. He was now dreaming, or so he thought. In his dream, Dan could hear the crickets in the forest, but was woken up by some strange steps walking around the forest and the leaves crunching beneath him, or it, as if some person or animal was walking in the woods. There are a lot of cats in our neighborhood, so he thought it was one of those cats, a possum, or maybe an owl. All of a sudden, he heard a low whisper that beckoned him and said, "Daniel, it's Professor X. The X-Men need your help. Come to the woods and help us." This strange but yet familiar voice was very similar to the professor's voice from his favorite cartoon, and it sounded like it was right outside his window. Since he was a naive and innocent child, he decided to get out of bed, put on his jacket and boots, took his glasses, got out of his apartment, and went to the ground floor. Once he was on the ground floor, he walked to his building's parking lot. He felt a little cold, so he rubbed his shoulders with his hands. The voice kept calling out to him, "Help the X-Men, Dan." Somehow, he felt extremely attracted to this voice like a metal to a magnet because he could not get it out of his head. He took a small leap to get on top of a small hill. He felt very scared, but he kept walking into the dark and creepy woods. While he was walking, he heard other footsteps and leaves crunching beside him. He felt like these steps were approaching his position. In that moment, he stopped walking so he could hear the steps more clearly, since he thought it was some crazy person or animal that was insane enough to walk in the woods in the middle of the night. Dan thought that maybe it was a possum or an owl, but then he heard a noise that sounded like a lion's roar. He thought it was very similar to the sounds the dinosaurs made in that movie Jurassic Park he had seen in the theater a few weeks before, and the fast steps from somebody or something running in his direction. Suddenly, Dan broke out of his trance. He looked around, and his little kid's mind felt so terrified that he passed out. When he fell to the ground, his body was positioned between a tall tree and a large boulder, so he barely heard how this trickster creature ran next to him and circled his location while it smelled the air in order to get his scent. Fortunately, the creature decided to leave. Dan assumed he had passed out for several hours because he was woken up by the sound of a woodpecker, cicadas, and birds that were on a nearby tree. With the heat and glare from the sun on his face, he rubbed his eyes, opened them, and looked all around him. He was in shock and felt horrified when he looked at his Spider-Man watch and saw that it was 6 a.m. He had woken up in the middle of the forest. He thought he was going to wake up in his bed because he was dreaming, but he had sleepwalked inside the forest in order to follow that beckoning voice. He saw how his clothes were full of fallen leaves, so Dan quickly stood up, brushed the leaves from his arms and legs, and ran away from that creepy forest which looked normal during the day. He climbed down the forest until he got to his parking lot and ran to his building's door, opened it, ran into the elevator, and saw himself in the mirror and could not believe what had just happened to him. Dan got to his apartment door and opened the door silently and tiptoed inside. Thankfully, his mother had not woken up yet. Since she would have never believed what had happened, he laid in bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had occurred last night. Now he completely believes his parents when they told him not to talk or listen to strangers, especially if they are in the middle of a dark and creepy forest. So Dan had so many questions and thought to himself, how did this creature imitate Professor X's voice? How did it know I would listen to it? How did it know I loved the X-Men cartoon? Maybe he would never find out, or maybe he would. Who knows? This occurred on my unit's last deployment cycle where we went on a UDP to Japan. I was in the Marine Corps infantry at the time. My company had the chance to go from Okinawa to South Korea for a training exercise that lasted roughly a month. Upon returning to Camp Schwab on Okinawa, our packed out supplies were shipped back in 2 shipping containers called Connex boxes, and until the boxes could be unloaded and inventoried, an armed guard had to be posted to make sure nobody tried tampering with our gear. Things such as blank ammunition and snowshoes were kept in the boxes, and it wasn't cheap. The watch always had 2 guys from the same platoon together just in case anything happened and there was an emergency, but the 2 guys only had 1 rifle with 1 magazine of live ammunition. I had got assigned one of the worst shifts, 1 a.m. to 3 a.m., but I didn't really care because we had the next day off due to it being a holiday, and I was buddied up with a good friend of mine. His name was Long, and we frequently hung out together. To get to this motor pool, we had to start walking 15 minutes early to show up 15 minutes prior. All of the vets listening to this know what I mean. Anyway, we were completely lost and made a wrong turn going out the side of the base zone and into the training area. We walk about 120 meters up this giant hill that eventually goes to a shooting range and a gas chamber. We find a lit cigarette on the road still smoldering. Nobody was even supposed to be out there in the training areas, so we quickly corrected our path and re-entered the base, creeped out that someone was out there in the dark, alone, smoking. We eventually end up finding the motor pool. When we arrive, me and Long are shocked to see that the military hadn't screwed us over for once and see the Marines we are relieving hanging out of the doors of a JLTV left for us to sit in, basically an up-armored replacement for the Humvee. However, our replacement's faces were pale. The one Lance Corporal stared blankly for a minute and said, "What the heck, man? That's not funny, and you know it's not. I could have shot you." Puzzled, I said, "What do you mean?" We got mixed up and walked into the training zone, and he just looks perplexed at this point. Then the other Lance Corporal speaks up and says, "Then who was it calling for a corpsman and then violently shaking the fence of the motor pool? We aren't stupid, and I'm not even mad. I just want to know how you got through vegetation that thick. The only other way to that side of the fence is that hole." He gestured at the gaping hole next to the JLTV. "We would have seen you walk past us," he said. We explained our every move, and he finally believed us. They proceeded to remove the magazine of the rifle and make sure it was clear before handing it off. After I received it, I promptly popped the mag back in, and we said our goodbyes. I was supposed to tell him if there was anything else as he wrote it up, and we were going to report it to our platoon surgeon in the morning. I hopped into the passenger seat while Long hopped into the driver's side. We got to talking, and after what seemed like forever, he started to fall asleep. I let him since it was only us and I wasn't tired at all. Not long after that, I swear I saw movement. I didn't clearly see anything though, and Okinawa has way too many stray cats, so I passed it off. Kind of on edge, something had changed in the air. It felt as if something was terribly wrong or like I was witnessing something terrible, but I saw nothing. Suddenly, I heard a faint, "Hey, Marine." It It was getting close to the time that our replacements would be showing up. Figuring it was them, I woke Long up and we hopped out of our vehicle. What happened next was the most insane thing I've ever witnessed in my life. Even in typing this, I feel as if maybe we both had some extreme mass hallucination happening. But emerging from the bushes and through the hole was a man, a Marine at that, but he was not one of us. He had no weapon, but held an old helmet in a bandaged hand that looked to maybe be missing a few fingers. There was blood on his face and all over his uniform. Not the uniform we were wearing, but an old one from the World Wars. His pants were absolutely shredded, and he was cut to heck. He looked like he had just full on pushed through hell itself. At this point, we were both just awestruck. He glanced at his arm, which had a nasty slice on it. Then to Long, he said two things. The first was, "Can I get one of those?" He pointed at Long's cargo pocket. He only has his cigarettes in that pocket, so he instinctively grabbed the pack and pulled them out and nervously said, "These?" The man just nodded, so Long pulled out a cigarette and hands it to him. The mysterious bloody historical figure standing over us just lights his cigarette and kind of grunts a thanks and turns limping through the hole back into the jungle. We hear him pushing through bushes getting fainter until it fades to nothing. As soon as the replacements arrived, we told them everything and they laughed in our faces. We agreed that we must have made it up in our heads. But when we woke up the next morning and went to the chow hall later, we sat down and Long is just nervously staring at me. I break the ice with the rude, "What?" And he says, "That pack last night was brand new. I woke up this morning and the only cigarette gone is the one I pulled out when you know what happened. It actually happened. The cigarette is gone." This has been a few years now and I've only told a few people. Most just claim that it's fake. But I have a nephew in now who just got back from an Okinawa deployment. He had no idea that happened to me. One day he comes to me and says, "You're never gonna believe what happened to my friend that had to work as a gate guard." I said, "Let me guess, a Marine from World War II needed a smoke before going back to work, right?" His jaw dropped. He said, "How did you know?" I just shrugged and said, "Lucky guess." After doing more research years later, I found out that there are multiple reports of this happening, and even some guys I served with later down the road ended up experiencing the mysterious man. I'm not a huge believer in the paranormal and never have been, but I have no logical explanation as to who this man was. I can only hope that for as long as he has to continue his spiritual battle in the Okinawa jungles, that his fellow brothers, even all these generations later in new camos, with new guns and gear and training, are willing to let him take a second to cool down and get a smoke break every once in a while, because that's what family does. I hope he is successful on whatever his mission is one day, so that he may be able to rest for good.